The Dornier-328 is a freeware regional turboprop for X-Plane 11. In this FSElite review, we will look at its systems and features and help you decide if you should add the 328 to your sim fleet.
Hello Sim Captains and welcome to FSElite. We are Tim and Lee from Flight Brothers FT. For those unfamiliar, we are content creators on YouTube focusing primarily on X-Plane 11. The aircraft before you is the freeware Dornier-328 available from the xplane.org forum.
Alright Lee, so are we going to hit the specifics first or we should start chatting about this bird?
Well, I don't know. Maybe we should, maybe the people want to know a little bit about the real plane. Maybe we can talk about that?
Alright gentlemen, we're going to keep it professional for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, and then at the end we'll do our traditional chatter about this bird. The real Dornier first flew in 1991. Manufacturing continued up until the year 2000. The 328 is a twin-engine turboprop built for regional airlines with a seating capacity of about 30. It's used primarily as a point-to-point transit aircraft, but is also operated by Special Operations Command of the U.S. Air Force under the designation C-146 Alpha Wolfhound.
The 328 is available free on the X-Plane forum. It was originally designed by Marian Gunther for X-Plane 9, but has been updated to X-Plane 11 by a small team of developers. We'll include the link in the video description below. There are numerous liveries included and others are available online for download, such as the American Eagle livery you'll see during this video.
Now let's take a moment to explore the exterior of this aircraft. Honestly, it's pretty nicely done, and that's really what first drew me to download and explore this aircraft. The textures are very nice looking. We've got PBR. We have a very high quality model with some of the finer details that you might expect to find on a payware, despite this being freeware. The APU exhaust port is visible on the empennage. The wipers are animated. We have rain effects. There's also ice effects, but I didn't get a chance to video those. We have numerous movable components such as the flight deck door, the primary boarding door, the aft service door, and the aft cargo door. And even there we have some of the finer details, like the last step on the primary boarding door rolls out from the door and then retracts with it. Very small detail for a freeware to have.
We also found that the gear was well modeled and animated. The internal area there of the wheel well is a little old, I think, by comparison to most X-Plane 11 standards. It is compatible with the default X-Plane ground equipment, and there is a floating texture. It looks like a couple dots or maybe knobs beneath the gear bay that we saw. But again, this is freeware, and if we go forward here and take a look at the flight deck, you'll see there are no visible pilots or animation visible from the exterior.
Alright, so moving on inside to the flight deck, I'm going to tell you to brace yourself for a moment. You probably won't like these textures. The layout does accurately resemble the real aircraft. The textures are HD, but they do reflect the X-Plane 9 origins of the aircraft. So when I say HD, obviously before you don't see true-to-life looking textures. But what you do see is crisp and precise. So even though you have these basic colors and some angular things where you would expect a round item, they are at least very crisp, particularly with regard to the fonts on the PFD and the MFD. That's always been an issue with the older or the default X-Plane aircraft, and they've taken efforts to clean that up here. And I will say, if you go and take a look at the actual cockpit of a Dornier 328, Dornier has selected a blue, somewhat plasticky looking interior, and if you look at it, it's just so different from the way other manufacturers have done the flight deck that I think you'll find that it makes kind of sense with the way they've done this one. Alright, so we do have some excellent detailed systems, and this seems to be where the developers have put their time. We have an included V-speed calculator, and we'll pop that up here. It's going to be queued from the MFD. We have a very thorough cold and dark procedure. You can grab that using the X checklist plugin, the file for X checklist is included with this aircraft, or you can just go down through the documentation just like any other aircraft. We also have some custom throttle position indicators, and those are going to help to mimic the throttle block between the flight range and the beta or reverse range. So they provided you with these interesting on-screen squares to show you both the port and starboard engine, and they'll show you if you're in the flight range or the beta range. And it's a little interesting to shift between the two because you can't always just grab your throttle and slide seamlessly. The chronometer, this is a neat little feature. There is a flight mode if you scroll on over, and it is automatically set to start and stop on takeoff and landing, so perhaps it has some squat switches on the gear there, but it's very nice if you're logging your flights in a logbook.
And for those of you that have the X checklist plug-in, this aircraft is compatible with that, so you'll get the, I guess, semi-automated checklist as you go through each of the aircraft procedures. Documentation included with the aircraft also includes system information, performance data, and checklists. Has fantastic visuals for you to look at. It's a 21-page document, good size on the text, so it's a fairly easy read. It's not rather laborious for 21 pages. And again, fantastic visuals showing you nav source modes, guidance control panels, general aircraft information about anything you want is going to be there. This aircraft does work with the default FMC. VNAV works, but as with the turboprop, the VNAV profiles aren't as important, I don't think, as some of the turbine aircraft, so it makes it easier to manage that descent. So while the default FMC is a little deficient in some airplanes, it seems to work fairly well in this one. You must use the pop-up, though. The 3D cockpit buttons are not all usable, and that's noted in the documentation. So you're really going to want to use that on-screen pop-out for data entry.
All right, so moving into some of the finer details here. The sounds in the cockpit, you get a battery tone when you start the batteries. You do have cabin chimes on the seatbelt and no smoking. Beyond that, you just have a standardized click sound for all of the buttons, nothing too fantastic there. And in kind of the strange of it, the engine volume on this aircraft seems insanely low compared to other things. So, for example, if you start the engines in this aircraft at whatever your normal volume setting is, you might hardly even hear it from the cockpit view. The APU does make a sound, but again, it is also set extremely low. There is not really an F-mod on here, so if you're going to move around the aircraft, you don't get a nice changing 3D dynamic to the sound environment. It doesn't make any particularly fantastic sounds in a flyby, but regardless, you do have the basic sounds you would expect to have on the aircraft. They're just not a super high level. So this is one of those moments where it starts to feel more like the freeware.
Well, Tim, should we talk about the flight dynamics a little bit?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the real world data, and then we can start to throw in our own observations from flying it in the sim.
Okay, so the real aircraft, according to some internet researching, I think was about 30,800 max weight, and this one's modeled at 31. So it's fairly accurate as far as that goes. Were you able, I know I wasn't able to find out the maximum internal fuel, but I believe it was around 7,500 pounds in sim, which is pretty generous considering how it sips fuel.
You know, I actually did not mess with it. All of my flights were about an hour in length.
Right, yeah, as were mine. So we were seeing about 320 knots true in this, and it was done over a few flights. We'll probably talk about that later, which ends up being about Mach 0.53, and I think the VNE on this aircraft, velocity not exceed, is about 270 knots. We found the taxi fuel flow to be about 270 pounds per hour, double that for the two engines. On a couple of the flights I did, one was at flight level 160, about 800 pounds aside, so 1.6 pounds per hour, and 1.2 sorry, 1,200 pounds per hour at flight level 240. I had one flight. I think I was doing Albuquerque to Phoenix. I had some yaw oscillations that were a little bit odd on descent with the flight idle power. Not sure why that was. Don't know if the yaw damp kicked on or off. I think the yaw damp kicks automatically on as soon as you rotate. Is that right?
The yaw damper comes on when you engage AP.
Okay.
But it does
right.
not deactivate when you deactivate the autopilot. You have to manually press the button to deactivate the yaw damper.
Okay, so some of that may have been self-induced. I think I did about 4 flights with this over a couple days, plus the one you and I did a while back, and that was the only time I saw that. So it could have been environmental factors or pilot error there. Also, the flaps allow for a very steep descent profile, good speed control. We don't know how accurate that is. However, due to a fairly low operating weight, the turboprop, I think it's believable. Speed control is very good once you get it down. I kind of found it difficult on descent to try and get the speed from that 250 range down to the 220, 200. And I think you can extend flaps. I'm sure if we have some video, maybe we can show that. But I think the flaps extended around 170.
There is a flap card on the front panel to the left, and Lee and I are actually not in the sim as we're recording this voiceover. We've done all of our recording at a different time, and we'll piece it together. So if you're wondering why we're saying this like we're not looking at it, it's because we're not. Yes, but the flap speeds are on that placard to the left of the PFD. Well, before we get into too much of just our observations, I wanted to make a note on flight planning here. There is no sim brief profile for this aircraft, which isn't surprising because it's a freeware. And to the best of my knowledge, there is not an available payware for this aircraft. So what I found to be comparable was I did a sim brief for the Dash 8 200, which is a comparably sized twin turboprop. You could probably do the Saab 340, but basically if you find one of its peers in that class of small turbos, you're probably going to have a very comparable fuel burn. And at the range we're flying these things, these are not transpac long haulers. Your diversion fuel on a regional like this might be equal or greater than your necessary flight fuel. So it's really unlikely that you're going to get into trouble by having a sim brief that might be off by a small percentage. So just wanted to put that out there. Dash 8 200, very usable on sim brief for planning.
Yeah, and on that note, I was working my way toward that. I've done the Dash 400 and the Dash 300, and the weights were grossly different. So I'll have to try it with your 200 model there and see how that looks.
Yeah, the 200's the smaller of the dashes, so that would change your burn immensely.
Well, Tim, why did we review this? And is it worth having? Because I wouldn't have downloaded on my own once we got to that interior. I typically need a little bit more than that. So do we want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, surely. So as is often the case over here when we've been doing our Flight Brothers channel, we've got a lot of strange aircraft, and they're almost always my fault because rather than just go out for the glitziest payware, I tend to dredge my way through the X-Plane forums for bizarro freeware. And it's mostly because I have a hobby of historical aircraft and other bizarre aviation missions and one-of-a-kind experimental models. And so I love finding those and just messing around with them. So
all this is true, by the way.
Absolutely. We've got some very weird content we've produced before. So I had been on X-Plane Forum on Facebook, and someone had thrown up some beautiful pictures of this Dornier-328. And other than his default ground scenery in X-Plane 11, I never see a 328. So I'm like, where did this come from? So I went and looked it up, and just like Lee, I saw that cockpit and went, ugh. But I had already installed Xchecklist plugin, and so as soon as I booted it, it immediately popped up this very elaborate cold and dark. And so I was like, oh, this is great. All right, so I start hitting buttons, and I found very quickly as it was powered up, I stopped caring because I was immersed. I was sucked in. And also, a trick for this, if the textures are really bothering you, I know this sounds ridiculous, fly it at night.
Right.
Because
I have had one night flight, and yeah, you don't really notice that as much.
you can't see those blocky sidewalls and that blue and the weird sort of marble looking that makes up the window pillars at night.
Right.
All you see is the screens, and the screens are beautifully done. The colors seem right, the placement's right, the fonts are gorgeous, and so, you know, if you fly this thing at night, it's gonna be fine.
A little easier on your eyes. So, is it worth having? Do you want to take this, or should I take this? Because I think we kind of arrived at the same answer.
The main thing when we're discussing value is it's always subjective. Depending on your
Sure.
budget and your desire, even the most expensive payware could be worth it to you and not worth it to the next simmer down the line. But seeing as this thing is free, you're almost at the point of why not?
Right. And then it kind of comes down to if you're going to use it. So if you're a virtual airline pilot, and I don't know how or if, maybe we need to look at that flight sim economy system, but this could be an airplane that works well for that. You know, when you're doing those 1 to 2, probably 2.5 hour maximum short airports, or, you know, like certain parts of the world have things that these regionals, the low passenger count demands would fly to, then it may really increase in its value. Can I say that?
Bingo. Okay, so we were going to tell you guys about some of the flights we did with it. And
Right.
really, this aircraft perfectly suited a need I had, and I didn't have a tool for it. There is a bizarre Icelandic airport called Ísafjörður. It's just tucked into this little fjord, very difficult to get to. It has to be a visual landing. You come in tucked in between the mountains. You've got to swing the aircraft around, put it on a runway that I don't even think they can pave it because it'll crack. So it's basically a high treated gravel, but it's not like a solid asphalt mixture runway. The only things they can get in there are these small turbos. So to replicate that flight, I do believe the 328 actually in the real world is used to go up there. So I did a flight up there. I started out in Keflavik. I got the whole way up to Ísafjörður, and when I dropped to minimums, I was still socked in. So unfortunately, I had to divert, and should I admit, I went a little farther than I should have. I almost clipped the. I saw terrain.
Whoops.
Yeah, I was at 800 feet, and I saw terrain. I saw a road pass under me, and that was the moment I just pulled up and said, "We're out of here. It's over. I'm not going to catch it." And you know,
And
there's
that's
always
the nice
that.
thing about being in the sim world.
Yeah, there's always that temptation.
You may have needed new underwear.
Right. Wait a second longer. We'll see. You know, we'll break through, and
Right.
that's a good way to get yourself killed. So
Yeah, it's taken many a real world pilot for sure.
yes, I went the whole way back to Keflavik again because your diversion fuel on these sorts of runs tends to be equal or greater than your flight fuel. Got back to Keflavik, refueled, checked the weather. It looked better, and I was very motivated at this point. I think I'm just stubborn. I just had to get in there, so so
Right.
I started it back up, went back up there, and landed it. And we'll include some of the footage. You know, the missed approach is there's not much to see, but I've got the actual landing here, so we'll throw some of that in. But this is not a trip I could have made with any of my payware aircraft because I don't really have an airliner for this. I have plenty of GA stuff that could get in there, but I didn't want to
Sure.
replicate GA. I wanted to do the airline. So how
Right.
about you, Leo? Like, have you found some value in this, or any particular routes you enjoyed it for?
Well, I don't think you and I we flew it just hanging out one day, Aspen to Denver. It
Right.
performed well in the high altitude elevations. Yeah, I can't remember. I think we may have had. I think we had rain on the approach there, maybe, or some gusty winds. It did well. On my own, I flew prior to actually making this video, Denver to Albuquerque, Albuquerque to Phoenix, Phoenix to San Diego. So those had, I think, block times of, I think the longest one might have been, I don't know, an hour and a half. They were all about 1.3 to 1.7 hours. I can't remember which was which. I was trying to do different airspeed, fuel flows just to kind of compare. And it's great for those routes. I think depending on the city, those are probably unrealistic because you would really probably use a Airbus or a Boeing 737, A320 for those routes. I think there's enough demand, but for those flights, it was really good. I think where this is really going to shine is maybe some of your Porter airline routes. If you toss the realistic flight numbers aside, right?
Right.
Your Porter Airlines, your what's Alaska's other one, like Horizon. If you're kind of flying from those large airports to those feeder cities,
Yes.
I think it's really where you're going to enjoy this mountainous terrain. Really take advantage of that turboprop performance is where it's going to earn its keep.
Now, this is something that's near and dear to you and I. We both love actually flying the aircraft, and we make jokes about people who get in, program a complex flight plan, hit LNAV, VNAV, and then let it auto land. Because,
Right.
I got on the sim to fly the plane, not to program the fake plane to fly its fake self somewhere. So
Might as well watch a YouTube video of someone else doing it, right?
hey, just watch us fly. Yeah, good times.
There you go.
So, do you feel with these regionals like you get more stick time because it's, it's door to door, up, right back down. There's not an extensive cruise. You barely have time to go to the kitchen for a fresh soda.
Right. Yeah, I do. And now having added this aircraft, I would have one more, I'd say comparable to it. That's the Fly Sim Q400 Legacy. And
And we're expecting an update on that soon, right? There should be a,
not on the Legacy, on the Q4XP, which is, yeah, the X-Plane 11 built one that they're working right now.
okay, but it's
But
the same real world aircraft, right? Just it's going to be a
yes,
much,
correct.
much higher level
Yes, correct.
simulation. Okay.
Yeah, so I think to a point, the two are comparable in the sense they perform the same mission. Obviously, the Q400 I think seats almost twice what this one seats.
Correct.
But yeah, to be involved and hand fly the plane. This does fly well on the FMS. I meant to, before we recorded this, actually fly this slant alpha using just VOR nav to check the performance of it. I didn't do that. I did do an ILS approach into Phoenix, and the ILS seemed to perform well, with the indication, alignment, and all that stuff. So in doing that, yeah, it was good times. I can't really find, other than that interior, if I had to hammer on something, it's just that interior, the cockpit appearance. The cabin looks fine, believable. You can say what you want, whether you want a cabin back there or not. There are people that kind of go either way. FlyJ doesn't include it. SSG didn't include it in the 748 or limit it due to the door
limited.
areas.
Right, you got the upper deck and the entryways.
Right. Zebo, of course, has it. And then you have people that complain about their frame rates with Zebo, whereas, FlyJ in one of our live streams on our channel said, we don't put it on there because hashtag frame rates. And
Right.
so you got to pick your poison.
Now, on this aircraft, I found 0 frame issues. This thing, everywhere I took it, every phase of flight, I didn't see any frame issues, but I understand, I even saw in one of the video clips Lee contributed to making this video, you got some frames down in the 25s.
Yeah, I did have one in the mid to upper 20s. To be honest, I think it was typically running around the 30-ish. as you're well aware, Tim, we fly, maybe for the viewers more, we fly real world weather most times unless we're trying to create a scene, but generally we just record what video is going on in the real world. So that day may have been a little bit more cloudy or had a few more layers in it, overcast, broken layers. So of course that takes its impact. So
And
not necessarily the plane.
you were at a custom scenery zone, right? The Mr. X K-San.
Yeah, correct. Well, on my Phoenix to San Diego flight, yes, but actually, and Phoenix, because we do have that as well. Denver to Albuquerque, default scenery.
Okay. Generally
and
speaking,
I don't remember which flight had that frame count.
Generally speaking, though, I feel like it's pretty frame friendly. I don't think it's going to really overtax your system, but all systems are different, so everyone's going to have a slightly different experience. We can't even guess how it will perform on a specific person's system. But I don't think, the aircraft that you hear about from everybody, like, oh, this thing bogs it down. I don't think you're going to find that with this. It's very basic, and it's also very small. I think the size is really going to help your frame rates. There's just not that much square footage to be rendered.
Right, and like I didn't check the flap detail, but that exterior modeling, it does have those the spoilers that deploy. I can't remember if they deploy
spoilers
on ground contact or on reverse beta, but as you're saying, there's not a lot on the exterior for it to have to do like a larger and more complex aircraft.
Right, and it did occur to me as we were running through those systems, we did not mention, but it does have auto feather. It does have the automated ground spoilers, which you activate and deactivate as per the proper procedures. So they did a good job with that.
Yeah, that's on the center console too, right?
Yeah,
ground spoiler arm.
on the pedestal, yeah, behind
Yeah.
the radios and the throttles. The Avatab is here. It's going to show up all over the video, even though we didn't mention it, if you haven't seen it. And it's really nice to have that Avatab, particularly for the VR crowd. Now, one thing we can't really speak to, neither Lee or I is set up for VR in X-Plane, so I'm not sure if this can be used in VR. I would assume having to use that pop-out FMS could be a deficiency in VR, but I don't really even watch other people's VR videos because I don't have the equipment, so it's not my interest at this point.
Well, and if you do use VR, and maybe if you can test that, comment below. Let the viewers and the FSElite community know whether it works or not. That would be appreciated. It's your way of supporting us and FSElite and letting the other people that may or may not be interested in this. Because for some people, if they spend the money on a VR, it might be a deal breaker if it doesn't work. But Tim and I can't speak to that.
Right. Yeah, no, if I was fully invested in VR, that would be a deal breaker for me, I'm sure. One other quick thought about just, why should you have this free aircraft other than it's free? I think flying regionals is not just a rite of passage in the real airline industry. It's actually probably really good practice for a sim pilot because, in between your GA and your swept wing turbine aircraft, you have these pretty decently powered high lift wing regionals. And the performance is, you're approaching the faster speeds. You're got the capability that you can actually fly the charted procedures as an airliner should at the speeds and altitudes an airliner would. But you're not going to be as bogged down. For example, like the 727 could be a very dangerous starter airliner for somebody. Because if you get behind the aircraft on power, let's say on an approach, the spool up on those old JT-8s or whatever they are is so long, you're probably going to crash the aircraft.
Yeah, and not even just a new pilot, but one returning to the flight deck. I took out the 727 just a couple days before recording this video, and on departure, I forgot how to activate the autopilot. So felt quite ashamed of myself.
Ah, yes. But now you have this forgiving nature here in this turbo where the
Right.
spool up time is not that much. The torque of the engines is incredible, and the lift on that wing is also quite incredible. I might have mentioned to Lee that when I landed this aircraft the first time, I had a nearly perfect landing, and that is not the case with me. This is anything but bragging. My first landing and usually my 30th landing, they're all usually pretty awful on new aircraft. But
Well, and you had a different landing experience than me, because on all of my flights, I've come in and then flared where I thought I needed to be, where the sight picture looked balanced, And what I've noticed in watching some of the replays and shooting the footage for this is I tend to flare and I hold it about 6 feet above the ground, and I'm like, okay, why isn't speed bleeding off? And then I release a little pressure on the nose, and give it back, and then I'm like, oh, there's the ground, so it ends up being rather
oh,
firm.
well, there's an interesting point right there. The flare in a turbo is going to be very different than a flare in a full-sized typical jet-powered airliner.
Right, and that sight picture is very important no matter what airplane you're flying. So you kind of have to get that muscle memory, and just like driving your car. If I drive my car, I know where it's at between the lanes, and if I hop in your car, it's going to be a little different.
Right, suddenly we're guessing. Well, I suspect I had a better experience just because not knowing what was going on, I had really flown it by the numbers on that first trip.
True,
And
yeah.
yeah, it just came down super sweet and easy. I guess the main thing I found was getting it stabilized. It was not a windy day. I was coming to Phoenix. Visibility was great. Had the ILS tuned up. And it was very easy to get the power set for the descent I wanted, and it just held. And it was beautiful. It was like an Autoland for all of our Autoland friends, except it was me. And it was very satisfying to see that touchdown, and it was just bang on the money. Perfect.
Should we start a thing called Manual Land? We'll do hashtag Manual Land here and tag FSElite.
Although, I mean, you can just generate a hashtag out of nowhere. Here,
What, a Manual Land one?
manual land. I'm gonna see it if
You
that
should
even
do it.
exists.
Hashtag Manual Land and.
Oh my gosh, there is a hashtag manual land as for post. And there's
Oh,
a
well, there you go.
hashtag
Well,
manual landings. Well, only one of them's a runway. There's a menu, a picture of hand lotion, and somebody on a bicycle.
oh, it is at FSElite. So they have at FSElite on Instagram and Twitter.
All right. Well, Sim Captains, I think that's about gonna wrap it up. We hope you've enjoyed this FSElite review of the Dornier-328 freeware for X-Plane 11. So until next time, I'm Tim.
And I'm Lee, reminding you to plan the flight.
And fly the plan.